Hey guys, we are back doing another Hell's Kitchen chef ranking, and today we'll be doing season 5, another expanded cast, and this was a pretty interesting list to put together. There were some very wonky placements here, and definitely some tough calls, but we'll be getting to that more in a moment. But there are 16 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 16, the chef I believe did the worst on this season is not the first boot, but someone who made it a little bit further, and that person is Seth. And again, Seth is technically the fourth boot of the season. Like he made it a little bit in the game, but he also did almost nothing right, where right off the bat he has a really terrible signature dish where he ended up putting honey and ratatouille, and he ends up laughing after Ramsay calls him out for this signature dish, which obviously annoys Ramsay greatly. Again, a really bad first impression. And moving forward, he ends up annoying a lot of his team to where no one really likes him, and he doesn't really have a single good service all season. Where in service 1, he ends up doing really poorly on the meat station, and he ends up getting put up as a target where everyone on his team wants him gone, but obviously he ends up staying. Service 3 is also really bad, where he ends up filleting the meat even though he has no experience doing so. He ends up wasting it, which really annoys Ramsay. He ends up on the block once again, and he probably should have gone home there, especially considering how bad his pitch was, where Ramsay was very visibly annoyed by his pitch. And I feel like he probably should have gone home over Charlie, but for some reason he's given another chance. And then episode 4 is also really bad, where during the breakfast challenge, he ends up taking over the egg station, claiming to know about Ramsay's egg recipes, even though he does really poorly there. And then the service is also bad, where he struggles on the fish station. He also has his moment where he wipes his face with a rag and then uses the same rag to clean a pan that obviously is bad. And then he's finally taken out at that service. So again, he does have a bit of longevity within him. He does technically survive 2 eliminations in which he was nominated, but I don't really give him too much credit for that, considering 1, he was the target at both of those eliminations, and 2, he ends up staying over people that didn't do as poorly as he did in either of those services. So I feel like to that end, I don't really give him too much credit for that, and I feel like he largely stayed due to him being a big character. But at the end of the day, I feel like he's by far the worst chef on the season, which is why he's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone pretty similar to Seth in a lot of ways, and that person is Colleen. And again, Colleen is another person that really annoyed a lot of her team, and especially annoyed Ramsay. Where similar to Seth, she has a really bad first impression, bad signature dish, and plus she ends up talking back to Ramsay, saying that she also teaches manners, so obviously that's not great. And similar to Seth, she ends up not having a single good service all season. Where in service 1, she makes a bevy of mistakes, like cooking in a dirty pan. You also have her confusing sugar for salt and putting that in risotto, which is pretty funny. Service 2 is also really bad, where she does really poorly on the fish station, gets nominated, and she probably goes home if G didn't have to pull herself from the game, so she kind of gets lucky there. Service 4 is also pretty bad, where she once again struggles, doesn't really keep up with the pace of the kitchen, and she is on the block again and is largely spared over Seth being a more actively bad player than her. And then her boot round is pretty bad, where she makes a whole bunch of rookie mistakes, stuff that you would never expect someone who teaches cooking to make. And then she ends up struggling on the dessert station, which is usually a pretty big red flag if you're on Hell's Kitchen, and she is eventually taken out there. So again, it is a pretty bad run for the most part. And yes, while Ramsay was harder on her due to the fact that she's a teacher, she still severely underperformed, and I feel like she got lucky at points, namely in service 2, where again, if G didn't have to pull herself in the game, she probably goes home there. So I feel like mixing that in with her lack of good services, I do have her here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we are finally at the first boot of the season, and here we have Sarah. And again, for a first boot, I don't think Sarah did that much wrong to be the first boot, especially with Seth on her team. Admittedly, right at the bat, she doesn't have that bad of a signature dish. While it does struggle presentation-wise, it does at least taste good. And while the service isn't great, where she obviously screws up a dish at one point, we have Robert and Charlie having to jump into the station. And while it's not great that she ends up volunteering for the block due to this bad service, I mean, the team was planning to target Seth, where Seth made a lot more mistakes than Sarah during that first service, not to mention having a much worse signature dish. And I feel like in most situations, Seth would be the first boot over her. However, I feel like due to her volunteering for the block and with Ramsay feeling like she didn't have it in her to stay, I feel like that just kind of led to Ramsay cutting her first, despite knowing that Seth was a worse chef overall. So again, I feel like in the grand scheme of things, I don't think she's the worst player in the world, and I feel like she probably did more things right in that first round compared to Seth, But obviously, at the end of the day, she didn't have too much potential in the game, which is why she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have another chef taken out a bit too early in the game, and that person is Charlie. And again, Charlie's run is also kind of mediocre, bad signature dish. We also have Ramsey telling him to shave his goatee before the first service, that's pretty funny. But at the same time, he doesn't do that poorly in the first service, where we even see him helping Sarah on the garnish station, which is pretty good, and he's largely able to get through that round alright. Now he does fall downhill after that, where service 2 he makes a whole bunch of mistakes on the appetizer station, and service 3 is also pretty bad, both in the kitchen and when he's a waiter, where obviously he makes a bevy of mistakes across both of them, and he's even rated the worst waiter by the customers, which is obviously a bad look. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, I still feel like he should have stayed over Seth at that elimination, where yes, while it is really bad that he did poorly on the waiter side, I still feel like he was a better chef overall compared to Seth, and he obviously didn't do as much to annoy Ramsey compared to Seth either. Now at the end of the day, he still probably didn't have too much potential in the game moving forward, and he probably would have been cut not too long afterwards regardless. But I feel like with him having these minor pros, it was enough to have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have G. And obviously G is a very weird player to assess on a ranking like this, as she very clearly had a lot of potential within the game, where during her brief run, she was clearly a standout, where right off the bat, she has a good signature dish, follows it up with a good service 1, and then in service 2, we even see her comforting Lacey after the challenge. But then obviously after that we see her spraining her ankle that eventually results in her leaving the game, but she's still able to push through the next service where she does very well there, and we even see Ramsey being very proud of her on her way out to the point where he allows her to keep her jacket. And it's very clear that had she stayed in the game, she would have done pretty well moving forward. And I feel like that makes it really hard to assess her on a ranking like this, as she's obviously pretty high for her placement, and I did debate putting her even higher on the list. But at the end of the day, she is still only the second boo of the season, and we really only have 2 services to go off of with her, which is why she is here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I kind of debate these next 2 as I feel like both of their games are really hard to assess. But number 11, I did decide to go with Lacey. And I feel like Lacey kind of fits this black sheep archetype we've seen over the last couple seasons, where it feels like she can't do anything right, that no matter what she does, her team is just annoyed by her, and obviously she makes a ton of mistakes there, but I also feel like she was kind of treated unfairly at points. But right off the bat, she has a pretty rocky premiere, where she has a bad signature dish, so bad in fact that Ramsey spits it out, and she does kind of get emotional before the service, where she has to step aside to take a timeout, and then obviously she doesn't do great at that service, where she ends up putting up raw scallops, but by episode 2, she is pretty much seen as an outcast by the red team, where she is by far the weakest chef, and is also someone that no one seems to like. And yes, while she doesn't help her case by not joining the team during the punishment, we later see her getting nominated after service, largely because her team just doesn't like her that much, and obviously she scrapes through that. But then we get to service 3, where she actually does okay in the kitchen, but she obviously does really terribly as a waiter, where she's rated the worst waiter on the red team, but they win that service, so whatever. We then get to service 4, where she is nominated almost entirely because her team hates her, where despite her not even having that bad of a service, she's just put up because the red team is fed up with her. But obviously she ends up getting swapped over to the blue team. But then we get to episode 5, where she gets really emotional after losing the challenge to the point where she wants to give up. Now she does follow it up with a good service in service 5 and an okay service 6. But by episode 7, we even start to see the blue team get annoyed by her, and she is later nominated once again due to her team not liking her. And then we get to her boot round, which is obviously pretty bad, where she struggles a lot in the meat station, makes tons of mistakes there. She even admits to Ramsey that she can't cook meat, and eventually it just becomes too much for Ramsey, and he just eliminates her mid-service. So on the whole, it's a really rocky game to assess. And admittedly, when I was watching this season, I actually kind of felt bad for Lacey, considering how often people would just dunk on her over and over again. It did feel a bit too much for me. But at the same time, I feel like it also largely defined her game, where due to her not being well liked, it caused her to constantly be on the block, constantly being in danger. And I feel like her cooking skills weren't out of this world either, but while she had a couple of okay services, I feel like it wasn't really enough to make me view her as a top contender, and also the fact that she was eliminated mid-service, that also didn't help matters. But again, it's a mostly mediocre run, which is why it's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we actually have the other person that was eliminated mid-service, and here we have Jay. And I feel like a lot of Jay's run is kind of average, Right off the bat, he does have a bad signature dish. That's not great. But I feel like for the first 3 services, he actually does pretty well, where he doesn't really make too many mistakes there. Service 4 isn't great, where he leaves the butt of a lettuce in a salad, causing a customer to send it back. But then we get to service 5, which ends up being a really terrible service for Jay here, where he ends up doing really poorly on the meat station, being really slow to getting out Wellingtons. He also puts up raw chicken, which is a bad look. He forgets an order, and he's eventually nominated here, but he's able to scrape through it, largely due to Colleen sucking so much, so there's that. Service 6 is kind of whatever, but then we get to his boot round in Service 7, which ends up being an astronomically bad round for Jay, where first up he ends up overcooking both teams' rice during the prep, where obviously he had to do the red teams due to a punishment, and I feel like I would have had him a bit higher if he had intentionally sabotaged the red team's rice, but the fact that he also sabotaged his own team's rice is obviously a bad look. But beyond that, he also does really poorly on the fish station, messing up dish after dish. We obviously have Ramsay being on his case, and then when he fails to deliver again, it obviously becomes too much for Ramsay, and he just cuts them right then and there. So again, it's a really bad service that ends his game right then and there, and obviously a big reason he is lower on the list. But the reason I have him above Lacey, despite him being cut earlier than Lacey, is that I feel like he was a more consistent chef during more of the season compared to Lacey. Then also he wasn't hated by his team to where he was only nominated once before his eventual boot. So I feel like those things were enough to have him above Lacey, though realistically not too much higher. So I have him here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Koi. And again, Koi's run is pretty average. Now, right out of the bat, she has a pretty good start where she has a good signature dish, and even her first 2 services are pretty good. Doesn't really make too many mistakes there. And it's not until service 3 that we really see her first mistake, that being a customer sending back raw shrimp that she had made. Obviously, that's not a good look. And the following dinner service isn't great either, where she ends up making a bunch of mistakes on the appetizers, though she is able to avoid nomination there. We then get to service 5, which is just kind of okay, but then we get to her boot round in episode 6, which is also pretty bad, where she's on the meat station and she ends up making a whole bunch of mistakes there. And again, she's just kind of taken out for not having too much potential beyond this point. And again, it's not the worst run in the world. I feel like the people we already talked about have more lows compared to Koi. But I feel like with her just kind of being average, I can't really have her too much higher than number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have a somewhat notable player in Hell's Kitchen history, though probably not for the right reasons, and here we have Carol. And again, Carol's run, very similar to Koi's, it's just kind of average. Right out the bat, she has a good signature dish, and she is a waiter during the first service, but she actually does pretty well at that, with most of the customers rating her above average. That's pretty good. Service 2 isn't great, where she makes some mistakes in the starters, and she is technically the chef that cost her team the service with her being too slow to get the final dish out, though she is able to avoid nomination there. Her next couple services are just kind of fine, where she doesn't really make too many mistakes there. We even have her calling herself one of the strongest chefs on the red team, which is pretty notable. You also have service 6, where she ends up avoiding nomination, despite Andrea, her biggest rival, winning best of the worst there. But I feel like her back third is when her game really starts to crumble, and I feel like a lot of it stems from her rivalry with Andrea, where we see in service 7 her blaming Andrea for her bad service there on the appetizers, though she's able to scrape through that. Service 8, she continues to not communicate well with Andrea, which leads to her making some mistakes on the meat station, and she's eventually nominated after that service in a spot where she feels like she's going home, though she's able to scrape through that. And then we get to her boot round in service 9, where she ends up putting on this really complicated dish on her menu that she fails to do the proper prep for, that leads to her really underperforming at that service. And while we see her making a good lamb dish at one point, she ends up making a whole bunch of mistakes at that service, and she's eventually eliminated at that elimination, despite her being on the winning team, the first time in Hell's Kitchen history that has happened. And obviously that's a pretty big knock against her on this player ranking, despite there being plenty of other options on the blue team that night that could have gone home. The fact that Ramsay went out of his way to eliminate her right then and there is obviously a pretty bad look. And obviously with her run being pretty average outside that, not really having too many highlights, I figured 8 was about as high as I could put her. Now moving on to number 7, and we had the highest ranked pre-Blackjack at boot left to talk about, and here we have LA. And admittedly, LA's run is also pretty average, though I feel like compared to Koi and Carol, it's probably a more consistent run, where yes, she does have a bad signature dish, but similar to Koi and Carol, she ends up getting through a lot of the early game without too much trouble, not really making a mistake until service 4, where she does end up struggling on the meat station, though at the same time, she was on that station with Colleen, who, as we talked about earlier in the video, isn't the best chef in the world, so even then, I'm willing to cut LA a bit of slack there, and she ends up recovering in Service 5, doing very well on the appetizers there, and even winning Best of the Worst, which is obviously more than I can say for Koi or Carol. Now, she is nominated in episode 6 due to her not being a leader, though at the same time, she doesn't really do that poorly in the service, she doesn't really make any mistakes there, and is able to scrape through that. Service 7 isn't great, where she's just kind of slow to get orders out, which obviously isn't a good look. But really, it's not until her boot episode in episode 8 where her game really crumbles. Where first up, she does volunteer to sit out of the blind taste test, which is already a bad look. But after we see Giovani do poorly at the test, we see her regretting this decision, which is also a bad look. And we see her doing pretty poorly at the service as well, where she struggles a lot on the garnish station, and she's eventually taken out, despite there being very clear animosity between Carol and Andrea at that point, to where it's really driving down the red team, and yet she's still taken out in that spot, which is obviously not great. But I feel like compared to the other chefs from the pre-Black Jacket, I feel like she does pretty well across the season. She obviously wins a Best of the Worst, which is pretty impressive. In general, I found her to be a more consistent chef throughout the season, where I feel like her only really bad service came in her boot round. So obviously that elevates her above the other pre-Black Jacket boots, but at the end of the day, I just found her run kind of average outside of that, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and obviously from this point on, we are at the Black Jackets, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And I'm not gonna lie, I did kind of jumble around the order to a degree, as I feel like there's a lot of really rocky players here. But at number 6, I decided to go with the rockiest player of them all, and here we have Ben. And I feel like Ben is a type of chef that had a lot of potential coming into the game, and I feel like he had a lot of potential to actually win it. However, I feel like he consistently underperformed during the season, and yet he somehow made it to the Final 4, where he starts off with a pretty good signature dish. In fact, Ramsey even calls it the best on the blue team, though he does follow it up with a shaky service 1 on the appetizers. And while he has a good service 2, he then follows it up with a very mediocre service 3, both in the kitchen where he has some issues on the dessert station, but also as a waiter where he ends up sending back dishes even though they're fine, and Ramsey is just kind of annoyed by him there. Service 4 also isn't great, where he forgets to give the red team their tomato butter sauce during the prep, which causes Ramsey to accuse him of sabotage, and then he proceeds to screw up the tomato butter sauce that he was supposed to make for the red team. And even outside that, he makes some mistakes on the meat station that results in him being nominated for the first of several times over the course of the season, though he's able to scrape through that. The next 2 episodes are kind of just fine, where while he does bad at the challenges in those episodes, he does pretty well in the services, doesn't make any mistakes there. But then we get to service 7, which is really terrible for Ben, where he once again messes up on the meat station, making mistake after mistake, so bad in fact that he's nominated by Ramsey, and he probably goes home there if Jay wasn't already eliminated mid-service, so he kind of gets lucky there. He is able to rebound the following service, where he does pretty well there. Ramsey even compliments him afterwards, but then he falls right back down in service 9, having another pretty bad service, where he ends up taking charge for putting the menu together, and he ends up following it up with a bad service, making tons of mistakes, ends up getting a lot of blame for a lot of the stuff that goes wrong there, gets nominated once again, and is pretty much saved by Ramsey eliminating Carol despite her being on the winning team. So again, he kind of gets lucky once again. And I feel like he plays pretty poorly at the Black Jackets as well, where at the final 6, he ends up winning the challenge only to have a bad service on the meat station. What do you expect? Final 5 is also pretty mediocre, where he's on the garnishes and he ends up screwing up multiple dishes as well. Ramsey gets annoyed by him, and then he has another bad service at the final 4, in which Ramsey has finally had enough. So in a lot of ways, Ben's game is really hard to assess, where I feel like on paper, he seems like a better chef and someone that you would expect to do well. And sure enough, we do see Ramsey giving him tons of chances to redeem himself, and yet I feel like he consistently underperforms all season. And I actually considered putting him below even LA, for example. But I feel like with him making it significantly further than LA, then also him like still having some highlights here and there, I did decide to give him the edge. But I feel like his game on the whole was incredibly rocky. So I feel like for those reasons, I have him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and kind of similar to Ben, I also find this person's game to be pretty rocky. However, I feel like this person has higher highs than Ben. And actually, we have Andrea, the final boot of the season. And despite her getting all the way to the final 3, I do find her game somewhat mediocre. Now, kind of similar to Ben, she does get off to a solid start, having a good signature dish, and having a decent couple of services right at the start. We see her being a bit of a leader on the red team during service 2 and service 3, helping out on the starters. And we even see by episode 4, Carol calling her one of the strongest chefs on the red team. Service 5 is where things get a bit rockier, where at that point she does really poorly on the meat station, and she ends up getting nominated here, but is able to scrape through that. We get the service 6, where she does end up winning best of the worst, despite her service not even being that great, where we even see her screwing up a risotto, and we even have her entire team disagreeing with her winning best of the worst, with her feeling like she had the worst service. And then we even get to the elimination, where she admits to Ramsey she doesn't know who to target, which annoys him. So despite this seeming like a pro for her game, I don't even think she plays this round that well. And moving forward, she kind of just drags down her team with her rivalry with Carol, which is pretty funny considering that Carol had previously called her one of the strongest chefs on the red team. And I feel like this rivalry translates to the services, where due to her inability to work with Carol, she ends up having a couple of mediocre services, where in service 8 she's even nominated once again, but is able to scrape through that. And while she ends up winning the battle against Carol, by that point she's considered the weakest link on the red team, and she follows it up with a really terrible service in episode 10 where she ends up storming out of the kitchen and she comes very close to quitting and is only talked into staying by JP. She ends up getting nominated yet again, and she probably should have been eliminated here due to her wanting to quit the game, but Ramsey ends up giving her another chance. We then get to the final 5/final 4, which is another really terrible round for Andrea. We're very similar to Virginia from season 2. She ends up getting immunity in a guaranteed spot in the final 3 after winning a challenge, but then proceeds to follow it up with an actively bad service, so bad that she gets nominated by Ramsey, and she is saved entirely by the fact that she already had immunity from winning that challenge, where Ramsey literally tells her that she would have gone home had she not had immunity. So I find that pretty bad. We get to the second final 4 service, which is also really bad, where she ends up making mistake after mistake on the meat station and kind of gets saved by the fact that Ben had an even worse service than her and had already been given tons of chances before. And then we get to the final 3, where despite her doing okay on the pass, by that point she was very clearly the weakest chef there and is kind of taken out because of that. So very similar to Ben, I find Andrea's game to be incredibly rocky, where despite her having a decent first couple of services, I feel like her game really goes downhill after service 5, and despite some highs such as winning best of the worst at one point, even that is contested, and I feel like her end game is so terrible where there are multiple points where she could have gone home, and by the end she was very clearly a weak link. And I feel like if Ben were more consistent, I would probably have Andrea even below him. But I feel like with her getting to the final 3 and technically having higher highs than Ben, I did decide to leave her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Giovani. And again, I'm not saying Giovani's a great chef in the grand scheme of things, and he definitely has his low points, but I feel like compared to Ben and Andrea, I feel like his knocks aren't as big as those other two. Now, right off the bat, he does have a rocky start with a bad signature dish, and then he follows it up with a pretty bad service where he's the waiter and he gets low marks there, but is able to scrape through that. Service 2 also isn't great, where he ends up putting raw salmon. Service 3 is particularly bad, where despite him running a steakhouse for a living, he ends up doing really poorly on steak night, where he has multiple customers sending back dishes. He also runs out of fillets. In general, he comes out of that looking pretty bad. And then service 4 is just kind of mediocre. So again, the first 4 services are pretty rocky for him, but I do feel like he picks it up in service 5 where he does pretty well there and he even wins best of the worst, so that's pretty good. Service 6 is also pretty good, and by episode 7 we even have Ramsey calling him the best on the blue team, which obviously results in him being swapped over to the red team, but even then he ends up doing pretty well at that first service, really being a leader for that group. And while he does go 0 for 4 on the blind taste test, he does follow it up with a pretty good service afterwards. So again, those are at least 4 services where he does pretty well and he's pretty out in front, but he does fall back down in service 9 where his service there is kind of mediocre. And then obviously he gets to the black jackets where he ends up having a really bad service, makes tons of mistakes, and he is eventually taken out for his decline in performance even though I feel like there's a serious argument for Andrea being taken out there instead. So on the whole, I do find Giovani to be a pretty inconsistent chef during the season, where he has a very mediocre first half and a pretty rocky end. But I feel like that middle stretch is pretty strong for him, where he wins the best of the worst. And I feel like he doesn't get saved nearly as much as Ben or Andrea were, where I feel like those chefs were kind of saved at multiple opportunities due to Ramsay giving them chance after chance. I feel like Giovani was able to get by without having to be saved as much. So I find that more impressive than what Ben and Andrea were able to put up, which is a big reason they're here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have the highest ranked player to not make it to the end, and here we have Robert. And obviously Robert's a pretty noble figure. He would obviously get a second chance in season 6. And while we'll talk more about that run in the next video, I do think his season 5 performance is pretty strong. Now right off the bat, he doesn't have the best signature dish in the world, and while it's not bad, it's definitely not the best. And while his service 1 isn't the worst in the world, he obviously has a couple of mistakes there. And he even has a moment where Ramsay asks him if he wants to go up on the block, but obviously he turns it down. But I think it really picks it up after that, where he does pretty well in the next couple services. And yes, while Ramsay calls him out for serving things on messy plates, I feel like he doesn't do that poorly across too many services. Now, service 5 is pretty rough, where he ends up making several mistakes there. This is also the service where Ramsay calls him Bobby, which upsets him a lot, and he kind of just stops communicating with Ramsay, though he is able to clear things up with Ramsay afterwards, and he manages to avoid nomination as well. After that, he does have a pretty solid stretch as well, doing well in the next couple services, though he does make a mistake in service 8. It's really not until service 9 that he has another bad service, where at that point he does pretty poorly on the meat station, where he screws up dish after dish. He also gets into a fight with Ben during service, which is a bad look, and he is eventually nominated by Ramsay, though he's able to skate through that. We then get to the Black Jackets, where he has a pretty bad service there, also makes some mistakes, though at the same time he manages to avoid nomination. And then after that, he's obviously pulled from the game due to some medical issues he had. So on the whole, I do actually find Robert's game to be pretty strong, where yes, while he did have a couple of bad services, I feel like compared to the people we already talked about, he was a lot more consistent during more of the season, and I feel like had he not been pulled from the game, he probably could have made it to the final 3, as I feel like he was one of the better chefs across the season, and while I think he would have been edged out by Danny and Paula by the end of it, I feel like he was still one of the more consistent chefs during the season, and a big reason he is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and obviously it is the final 2, it's just a matter of ordering them, and this was tough. I feel like these two are extremely close. I feel like they both played extremely impressive games with relatively few holes, and again, it was kind of hard to parse that all out, and this may actually be a bit controversial, but on number 2, I did decide to go with Danny, the winner of the season. And again, I feel like Danny played a pretty impressive game, all things considered. I feel like I would have him reasonably high on a winner ranking, but I feel like compared to Paula, I think he has a few more holes in this game. Right the bat, he has a pretty bad signature dish where he ends up grilling some bananas. He even tells Ramsay that he pulled the idea out of his ass, only for Ramsay to say that he should put it back in there, which is pretty funny. But even beyond that, he has a pretty rocky service 1 where he overcooks scallops, and he also gets into an argument with Ramsay, which is a bad look. So again, I feel like he gets out to a pretty rough start. But after that, he does recover extremely well, where he ends up putting up a strong showing in services 2 and 3. We get to episode 4, where he ends up calling himself the strongest chef on the blue team, and this does put a target on his back, with Ben seeing him as his cocky kid. And while he doesn't do great in the following service where Ben wants to go after him, he's able to avoid nomination there. But again, he's able to recover pretty well from that, where from that point on, he does pretty well in the next couple services, being one of the more consistent chefs on the blue team, where we see Ramsay calling him out for doing a good job in service 8, and in service 9 he wins best of the worst. We get to the final 4 where he manages to avoid nomination both times, despite him being one of only 3 options to be taken out there, which I do find somewhat impressive. But then we get to the final 3 where he does come in last place during the challenge, with over 3/4 of the chefs saying that he had the worst dish, which is pretty bad. He also has a shaky performance on the pass, which isn't great, and he is eventually nominated by Andrea, though he was very clearly going to make it to the final 2 in that spot. And then we get to the final service where he does have a couple missteps, like almost sending out a bad dish and also like having a risky menu, though he manages to do enough to actually win the game at the end. So obviously on the whole, it is an extremely impressive game and definitely one that I would put highly on a winner ranking. But again, I feel like he does have a couple missteps, and I feel like compared to the number one person, I don't think he is as clean as that other person, where I feel like he made a bit more mistakes, had a couple more bumps along the way, and I feel like that was just enough to leave him outside the top spot, so he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the chef I believe played the best on Hell's Kitchen Season 5 is Paula, the runner-up of the season. And again, this may be controversial as obviously Danny's an impressive winner, but I feel like Paula just edges out Danny in my eyes, where I feel like she's an all-around solid and consistent chef, very rarely making any mistakes. Right at the bat, she has a good signature dish, which is pretty good, and moving forward, she very rarely makes any mistakes during the course of the season. Now granted, it takes her until service 10 to win a best of the worst, but I feel like before that, she was playing pretty well, where we see her in service 2 helping Colleen on the meat station. In episode 7, we see Carol calling her the strongest chef on the red team. And before the Black Jackets, the only mistake we ever see her make is in service 8, where she does mess up a risotto, but we immediately see her fix it, which is pretty good. Now, similar to Danny, she is nominated once during the season, that being at the first Final Four round. However, her service there wasn't even that bad. She was only nominated in the first place because Andrea had won the immunity challenge, and we would see Ramsey cutting her off mid-pitch to take her off the block. So even then, I don't really fault her for that nomination. We get to the final 3 where, unlike Danny, she actually manages to win that challenge, with most of the chefs saying that she had the best dish, and while she didn't do the best on the pass, she manages to avoid nomination there entirely, which I do find pretty impressive. And then we get to the final service where I feel like she largely performed around the same as Danny, and I actually feel like she had the worst team of Danny, where we saw Andrea really struggling during that service, so she had to contend with that. So I feel like to that end, I feel like Paula is very much around the same level as Danny, where I feel like both of them played extremely dominant games for the most part, and I feel like both of them would have been pretty deserving winners of the show. However, on this ranking, while I feel like Danny's game was impressive, I feel like Paula's was a bit more consistent in my eyes, with fewer down points, and in general, I feel like she was a more consistent chef than Danny over the course of the season, which was enough to give her the edge for me. So because of that, she is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week with the next ranking, so you can look forward to that. I am covering other reality shows as they are coming up, so you can expect coverage of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.